My name is Natalia Escobar, and I am a professor of architecture at Carleton University. And I'm hosting this event with wonderful colleagues, Tammy Gaver, director and professor at Laurentian University, Mercedes Garcia Olguera, professor of Manitoba University, Andrew King, senior partner and chief design officer at LeMay, Joshua Taron from the University of Calgary, and Bechara Helal from the University of Montreal. And we are hosting the event with the support of Professor Lisa Landrum from the University of Manitoba. And I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. But we are gathering people today living in many other traditional Indigenous territories. So we acknowledge that all across Canada, settler relationships to both the land and the peoples of this land have been broken and misused. And we commit to support the project of decolonization. In particular, this workshop aims to contribute to dismantling racist and other oppressive practices in architectural research and design. This workshop is part of a series of 3 workshops organized by the Canadian Council of University Schools of Architecture to advance in equity, diversity, and inclusion in architecture. And the first workshop was on teaching and learning. This one is on research and practice. And on May 27th, there will be the last one on service and engagement. These 3 workshops support the annual Canadian Architecture Forums on Education, or CAFE. And this year, the CAFE Forum event will actually take place at Carleton University at the end of September. This second workshop in the series is entitled Equity in Design Research and Practice. And in this session, we would like to discuss with you what EDI means in design research and practice, what are the challenges of pursuing EDI in community engaged projects, and how to reconfigure current systems around merit assessment, funding allocation to better support EDI research and practices in architecture. So our guest presenters today include Professor Mena Aga, Honor Black, along with Lancelot Kaur and Sean Bailey, and finally, Julia Pascuto. And our guests will first deliver some brief Pecha Kucha presentations. And following the talks, we will open breakout rooms and kindly ask you to join and discuss the topics of your preferences. There will be three different questions. So before I introduce Mena, Professor Gaver and King will say a few words about the present urgency and relevance of these discussions in architectural research and practice. So please go ahead whenever you're ready.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us here today. And it's really important, I believe, to have these conversations about inclusion and participation. And often these conversations can be hard, right? And they're coming after decades of calcification. And it's important for us, for those of us who never saw ourselves in the curriculum or saw the reality of global complexities in the curriculum, it's important for us to have these conversations, but equally as important to talk about this with respect to research and practice. When we're thinking about inclusion, we're not just thinking about content, but discussing methods and approaches that sometimes often limited participation or engagement with subject matters that pertain to equity, diversity, and inclusion. I think this is an important moment for us to move past questioning ourselves and why we don't belong, and start to question the systems and how to make sure that those systems can empower and engage.
Thank you very much, Tammy. So Andrew, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, I think I would, and in your Natalia, in your notes, you wanted me to talk about EDI and research and practice, and I think it's something that's consuming us right now. And I have as you mentioned, I have the advantage of being heavily involved in practice, but also as professor of practice at McGill, sort of balancing these issues around research and practice, around EDI issues specifically, or LeMay, what we call JEDI issues, because it gives it, I guess, a popular cultural based acronym, which is always more effective in some way. I think there are two conversations. It's driven by attention, and the first conversation is one that's more difficult, and that's really how within the practice we actually reach out. We've got 400 people in our practice. We're trying to create effective conversations around inclusionary strategies, around understanding the various stories, around understanding the principles that Tammy was talking about, and how we can actually address those. And I think those conversations are difficult. I think they're difficult to calibrate, and I think they're still vague, and we're still trying to find our way through. And as a very large practice, we're meeting those challenges, I think. The other conversation though is outward. So that's within the practice, but outward. And that's what we're trying to do within, and certainly what I'm trying to do within my convergence as professor of practice at McGill, is how actually design research or applied research can deal with EDI questions, EDI design problems. And we really are an applied research studio. And the work that Julie is going to be speaking about later is related to that. But, we have a series of projects. Place de Montréal is a big public space. It talks about how the city can recalibrate around the identity of women within the city, around the identity of women of color, women of history and indigeneity, slaves, nuns, nurses, and the victims of various pieces of our history. And we're also trying to include and really be in the forefront of, in our Sensory Spaces project, of adults with autism, how to actually take the cognitive realm and expand that realm and understand how design can respond to these things. There's also work with the Climate Haven Cities. Josh Taron is part of this group, and we're working with the University of Calgary and the City of Calgary around how inclusivity can be part of a climate haven strategy. And then there's the gender inclusive stuff that Julia is going to be speaking about today. But really, at the end of the day, it's really about finding as many paths as possible, finding as many journeys as possible, and always understanding that EDI issues are at the center, at the fulcrum of those conversations. And we're trying to have as many, maybe perhaps a little too fluidly, perhaps a little too promiscuously, but we're trying to have as many conversations as possible.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So after these reflections, I would like to welcome our first guest speaker, who is Professor Mena Aga. Thank you, Mena, for joining us. Please go ahead.
I am, full disclosure, I'm in the middle of a design build, and I kept thinking about what do I want to talk to you about today, about practice. And I just kept going back to the point of studio. Every clash I am having at this moment made it that I would like to go back to that point of studio again. I know you've spoken about education, but bear with me. This relates to the topic of practice, at least from where I stand. As Natalia said, I am a proud Nubian woman. I echo the voices of my grandmothers in my head when I think about my practice and who I am as an architect and who I am as a teacher. What do I want to be and what do I want to teach? So I was going back to this point about us as architecture researchers, as we often forget to study the spaces in which we study. So we do all this research about the city and communities and typologies, and they forget to turn around and look at that space from which we stand. Before I go into that critical distance, looking at that space and how it infuses layers of injustice into our practice and research, I would like to confront EDI coloniality to start with. As a Black woman in architecture, as a Black woman in a white institution, I deal with bad faith, with EDI politics. It's a point of self-care, but it's also a recognition and refusal of my intelligence to be insulted by some of these politics that are created to isolate through isolated underfunded committees, for example, isolate the work from the practice within the studio. It's something that you do on the side. But also the fact that it's this constant negotiation with white systems. So it's equity, because they had all this discussion around equality and they don't like the word. It's diversity, because it's enough to have my brown face and black face, but my black thoughts are going to be pushed back against. And it's inclusion, which I think is the most problematic in them, because it recognizes the fact that there is a center who has the power and who has the power to include me in that discussion. So before going there, I'd like to cite and repeat what Angela Davis said about these politics, reminding us that we should not fall into the coloniality of these subjects, and remember that what we're working for is justice. So the point of departure for me here is thinking about justice. The studio has always been this amazing device of environmental mimicry that is preparing the student to go into that big studio, so the fake studio, or like the auxiliary studio, no, let's call it the proxy studio, in our architecture education, that is kind of mimicking how the practice studio is going to look like, already comes with restricted entry. How do you get into the architecture school? Who gets to be in the architecture school? What kind of economic and social markers that allows you to go there? And once you are there, how can you sustain being there? Even though in architecture education and architecture in general, we often announce our social agendas and claim that we are working from a social conscious position, the door itself that brings us to this place is already a pointless restriction. And I know that because I was an anomaly going through the door. People who look like me, people who were born where I was born, people who come from the class I come from, do not go through that door. And so I am very conscious of that restricted entry. So when I am in that space, I know that I have lost a point already. We are in that, there is a restriction of entry. Before we talk about EDI, there is a whole population that did not have the option to enter that elitist space. And this has been before, even though this has been historically the case, especially as architecture was this gateway to upper middle class and elite communities, was always open, was often open only to white people. While now architecture education does not promise as much social upward mobility. Most of our students know that they're going to have to be architecture workers before being architects, and maybe are going to spend all their time being architecture workers. But let's just discuss these restricted entries beyond the demographic considerations. One that I think is so quantitative and so paramount is architecture economics. We are an expensive studio or space of study. People know that before coming in. People know that the first year architecture list of purchases is it's a 1 arm long or a foot long. It's a long list. You have to go and buy your table and buy all these things, and then buy a computer, but because you're not going to use the table anymore and you're only going to use it to use the computer. So there is this kind of at the gate, a dollar sign at your entry to this space. This is something that I think is one of the core markers or one of the core dynamics of our studio as a social engineering apparatus. It really separates who would be there. And I have had this conversation with many of my first year students who had to leave architecture and go elsewhere. And I've worked in several universities because of the cost at the first year of architecture education. I tried to help, I tried to run, or I am categorically against spending any money in studio. And I tell my students I run zero cost studios, or not zero cost. They still spend money on electricity at least to work, but they should not pay any money for our studio. And when I taught first year drawing and we needed the tools, I asked my students to go cut these tools using the laser cutter to kind of reduce these costs. these kinds of interventions, to me, I think are so important and radical. Maybe all the students that are there already can afford these tools, but what I'm trying to do is to find a mechanism through which I tell the one that didn't come in yet and that knows that they can't pay for all these tools, that there is a chance to get into this space without that kind of hurdle. Because I am just reflecting on the struggle that I would have had to go through, anxiety. And I think that's a big tool, a big systemic tool to ensure compliance. The fact that we have to work and pull full-nighters, the fact that we have to meet deadlines, the fact that we have to work through all this anxiety makes it that the system lets us eat up into ourselves and suspend our moral faculties and not think critically about what we are doing. My colleagues outside of architecture have all these horror stories about just working for deadlines and discovering that they are working on an officer's lounge at a certain prison, or working for things that are completely against their political interest. But while we work in anxiety, we don't think critically. We don't have the time or the space or the emotional capacity to take critical distance. And we teach our students in the architecture school to work through anxiety. Universality. This is a drawing by one of my students who decided to really redraw his campus in Arabic. What does it look when he starts drawing in Arabic? And what does it look to start drawing it, seeing things through a different episteme? And this becomes this space of privilege that he gives himself. On the other side, I have to have all these discussions with people who are from non-Western paradigms, Indigenous students, especially Indigenous students. And I had this discussion several times, who were speaking to me about a studio that requires them to design a museum for Indigenous people. But what if a museum is ontologically inapplicable in their episteme? What if the exhibitionist complex does not exist within that culture? Another student from another school asks me for advice and tells me we are supposed to build and design a training school, a decolonial training school for Indigenous and an Indigenous community. The fact that there is absolutely no epistemic repositioning at the beginning of the studio, and that the epistemic repositioning is not a training that we have in architecture, because honestly, we don't really have enough faculty members from different paradigms to start with. Usually the majority of a faculty body are white people, and then there is the two diversity people at the end of the line. Look at the hiring policies all over architecture universities, all of North America, or in Europe it's worse even. But this is how it looks like. How can we then avoid universality that brings that brings a student here to be epistemically displaced and sends us all to serve a white paradigm and a Western paradigm outside of the architecture school? How can we think about practice that is decolonial if we don't really offer them anything else? How can we think about something that is decolonial, that when they come here, we wash away anything that is non-Western and send them there, because the institution is not qualified to sustain, promote, and develop other epistemes and other realms of knowledge and other realms of value. So how do we go from here? I'm trying to move away from solutionism, but I'm just also like to think about possibilities. What else is there? I think an important skill that our students take from studio to practice is isolation. This is a photo from a highway in Cairo with an advertisement for these kind of upper high-class apartment buildings in the middle of the so-called informal settlements in Cairo. Funny enough, I know the render company that did this and the architecture company, and some of them were students from where I was teaching. The fact that this product that is completely disconnected from its realities comes in and sits ironically next to a very different reality. And the studio, and this does not shock the studio. This does not create any shock. It's completely normal that we live in this schizophrenic state, that we can sit here and build somewhere, build for somebody, but forget the frictions and the ruptures that already exist. The fact that we don't ask our students, what are your political interests? What do you want to work for? What do you want to draw, and how do you want to draw it? This is a reclaiming studio. It's a furniture studio more than an architecture studio, but it was in Lebanon, and they started thinking about materiality of war. How can we reclaim and how can we heal? So reclaiming and healing as methods, repair and reclaim and heal as a method, not just an auxiliary side thing that we do because it's a buzzword, but as a process. What does that mean for our practice, and then what does that mean for them outside of that, out of this proxy studio to the practice studio? And lastly, I would like to think about teaching transgression. We don't teach them to say no enough. We don't accept them coming to us and saying, no, your syllabus is problematic, or no, I don't want to design this. I think my interest is served designing something else, or I would like to challenge such a rule. I think we don't teach enough or open the door enough in architecture, me including, for refusal. So I'm trying that as well. What is the utility and the importance of refusal as a reflective device as well, for me as a teacher, as a reflective device to what happens after. The fact that they can, when they graduate, they can say no. Am I out of time or something? Okay. Do I have time? Can I say two more things?
Yes, Mena, if you want.
Oh, because I saw the chat. I thought somebody is telling me to stop or something. Anyways, so there is an interesting book titled Gendered Practice, and it has anonymous stories about architects in practice, about how this field kind of drains you and has you become kind of forced to become complicit, working against your own interest. One of the stories about a queer architect who found themselves on site surveying a place to be demolished for an apartment complex. That space is a very important queer community space that has been possessed and taken by the developers. The fact that this person is surveying and helping in the process that is completely against their political interest. What process of training that makes us stand there and dig our own graves? What process that makes us stand there and be part and put our labor in the work that's completely against our political interest and against our well-being? I tried to write a little bit about this and about the architect as an emotional laborer, and then the architect as from the point of studio, how can we think about architecture as emotional work? How do we think about a different ontology of the architect instead of just the intellectual worker that we have now? Historically, it was the manual laborer, the manual worker and the master craftsmen were considered architects, how can we think about the architect now as an emotional laborer, and what does that mean for our work in the future? Because anxiety and refusal and all the things that I'm trying to talk about are actually emotional to start with. I will try to not run up my time. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your reflections and comments and questions and fights if you want.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'll just begin with a land acknowledgement that we are presenting to you from Treaty 1 territory as representing the University of Manitoba, which is located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and the Dene people, and that our colleague Sean Bailey is presenting to you from Treaty 3 territory, which is the land of the Ojibwe, Chippewa, and homeland of the Métis Nation, and that the water or tea in which I am drinking today is extracted from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation, where we are located, and the electricity that we're using to speak to you today and to participate with you today comes from Treaty 5 territory. All right, so over the last decade as faculty members and instructors at the University of Manitoba, we've begun to use our classrooms and design studios to engage in partnerships with Indigenous communities. Our aim has been to develop meaningful research and studio projects to explore how the design disciplines can learn from and contribute to the needs and ambitions of Indigenous communities. Through this intent, the projects have aimed to position Indigenous communities as the guiding voice, opening the way for those communities to shape the goals of the studios, of the classrooms, of the creative design projects, and ensuring that the outcomes always serve in a good way. This work has been an opportunity for us to reconsider how contemporary architectural education can evolve past the colonial frameworks that determine much of the present discourse. We believe that these studios are the platform for exchange, a back and forth, a gathered relationship between our programs, students, instructors, and Indigenous community members. We ask, how can we decolonize design practices and create reciprocal praxis for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous practitioners, students, and scholars? To answer this question, we've begun to develop a decolonial and unsettling design framework to help guide both students and instructors to work through an Indigenous lens, or a lens that we refer to as seeing with two eyes, to learn from the strengths of both Indigenous and Western knowledge for the benefit of all. By bundling a philosophical and dialogical collaboration with both Indigenous ways of knowing and Western schools of thought, we hope to create a mutually beneficial and synergistic relationship as a way forward. And so I think now that it would be a good time to toss it off to Lancelot. Lancelot, you tell me when to proceed.
Sure. Thanks, Honor. Good afternoon. The following 5 Indigenous design paradigms have guided the research and teaching that Sean, Honor, and I have used to connect to our students, community partners, and the land. They're not meant to replace Western systems of knowledge, but they're intended to expand the scope of practice to include what these systems ignore and actively suppress. As such, they're designed to reposition the designer as a mediator between various ways of knowing and provide the tools to help connect design practice to place, people, and the world we seek to improve. Denakimigad. It takes place, happens in a certain place. To truly understand a place, you must subject yourself to it, be immersed in it, and commit to the experience it offers. Denakimigad allows us to recognize that where we are is more than a place, but a site of opportunity to connect with the profound teachings of the world around us, to connect and consider all of our relations, and to recognize place as an animate being that we must respect in order to learn from. Andotan. Listen for it, wait to hear it. This paradigm is about spending time on the land, connecting with the place, and being guided by your intuition. It's about working in whatever way you desire, letting your heart and impulse reveal new possibilities. We believe that Andotan is the first declarative work, where students and practitioners reveal what they've heard, and what they've heard is important. Bawajigan. A dream, a vision. Through listening, dreaming, and following your intuition, Bawajigan is the realization of Andotan. It suggests that by performing this intuitive and reflexive practice, a vision will appear. The vision or visions that Bawajigan offers is not so much a manifestation of a design, but rather a set of relationships that reveal themselves in order to help guide the design direction, a way of moving forward in a good way. Meshkwad, in turn, in exchange. As a process of humility, Meshkwad combines two directions. The first is to understand the gifts that we as designers can give. And the second is to understand what gifts will benefit our community partners. We believe that gifts should go beyond the intention. As designers, we should ask ourselves, what are we giving back? Consider how the exchanges of dreams and visions, both from our partners and from us as designers, inspire, empower, and connect with people and place, connect with the land, and manifest materially. Nagutun, make it show, reveal it. The success of a project should be revealed in its ability to tell a good story. In design, storytelling happens when you acknowledge the journey and bring that through the project. Storytelling is the language that designers can use to engage with the Indigenous and settler public, to bridge worldviews by how the designs bring us closer to the land, each other, and our responsibility to be good stewards of both. And now I'm going to pass it over to Sean.
So to start this off, I would just like to say a quote from Danielle Desjarlis and Jordan Cantafio. They're co-presidents of our faculty's Indigenous Designing and Plan Association. And what they say is, as designers of environments, it is our duty to maintain a symbiotic relationship with the land, not only as Indigenous students and scholars, but as humans. And so this next little story will really begin to touch on a little story that Lancelot and I in honor went through, and something that's beginning to cultivate at the University of Manitoba. Next slide, please. And next slide. So this is 80 acres of forest that I came across, and we're turning it into a land-based education to begin to develop our connections with the land and begin to understand and how we can work with the land and see land as part of us and not separate. I think it's about returning and leaving the objective world, but revealing its animacy and working with its animacy. Next slide, please. So as a test, this is my good friend, Kelvin Skeed. He's a cultural guide, and he helps us with all our studios, and he's the one who has been really developing this process alongside with us. And he's always said to start things off in a good way, that we must honor the land and we must feast the land and we must take part in ceremony. And so this is the students coming, and it's a one-day workshop. We're taking 75 little poplar trees that we are going to make something with it. And these poplar trees were just artifacts from hydro line cut. And so to start this off and to discover what we're making, we take part in ceremony. And as part of ceremony, it also means giving gifts back to the land. Next slide, please. So each part of our feast went into little birch bark baskets that Kelvin made. And basically, the students were provided a set of instructions to give back to the land. So this is one of the baskets with pieces of our feast given to the fire for our ancestors. The next slide, please. This is a gift to the land. This is a gift to all nature, to all its beings. Next slide, please. And this is a gift to the wolf that lives on site. And there's one that does live on site. And so we always honor the wolf. Kelvin always instructs us. But it does this really amazing, profound things. It begins to think of the narratives that we apply onto the land. And now with these narratives, we become connected with it and we see it differently. Next slide, please. And this is giving the gift to water, which is our life giver. Next slide, please. The feeling after this, doing these gifts, changes the tone of the work. We're no longer architects going on to make something, but we're rather communicating with the land and listening to the land and understanding what it wants from us. And so, next slide, please. what we notice is students go off and do this. They begin to contemplate, they begin to really understand the place, they begin to acknowledge where and who they're connecting with, and they begin to see the land in sort of this different way. Next slide, please. And so these were the sticks, and the goal was not to have an intention, a design intention, but actually experience the land in some way and experience the materiality and listen to it and ask it what it wanted to be. Next slide, please. And so based off the notion of play and discovery and listening, students began to, feel these poplar trees and begin to understand what it wanted to be. Next slide, please. But through the process of making and playing and talking, students began to really discuss with each other and became this really team building. And through ceremony, almost this openness became this dialogue, which was just really amazing. Next slide, please. But it was really also interesting to see that it wasn't a dialogue around each other. It was a dialogue between the land as well. The land was a character. Next slide, please. And next slide. So you see students sort of working together. Next slide. So this was the result. That day that Kelvin came and did ceremony, he forgot his cape. This cape is something that he wears for ceremony, and it has a picture of a Sasquatch that he was gifted, a Sabe. He was gifted because he did a walk to Ottawa for missing and murdered Indigenous students. And he didn't see this being built, but that day he forgot his cape and it had a picture of a Sabe on it. And through that, the conversation of this day and working was actually about honesty. Everything was about honest the land, honest the material, being honest with each other. And when I texted, Kelvin didn't know why he forgot that red shirt that he always wears for ceremony. But when I showed him this, it reminded him, because this, he said, was the house for Sabe. And so what it did was this narrative became. And it was just this really amazing experience about how the stories that nature reveals to us is our avenue to connect with it. Next slide, please. So that's just it in the winter. And then next slide. And because of these efforts, we received a beautiful donation from Laura Files and Brent Whitby, and we're turning this into sort of a land base where we can, for our faculty, where we can begin to dream into these possibilities of trying to decolonize what it means to make architecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honoré, Shaun, and Lancelot, for this crucial presentation reflecting on different practices to decolonize design and pedagogy.
And thank you. I'm really happy to be invited and included in this really important conversation. As Andrew mentioned, I am with fieldwork with LeMay, and I'm here presenting my gender inclusive design study, a condensed format just for time sensitivity. So just wanted to introduce myself and my co-researcher. It's important to sort of talk about sort of the full picture, but we started this at my former firm. I was working in San Francisco, and this was born out of a project that I was lucky to continue to work on remotely, me from Toronto and him from Kansas City, and highlighting Mission Bay Elementary School, which is where we started to implement our first Universal Design for Learning school, which is all about designing for each and every student and understanding there's a lot of complexity when it comes to the learning environment that is not necessarily thinking about all of the students and how they learn within that environment. So as a part of that early work for the school, we were designing a lab space for a high school component. And one of the workshops where we were sharing precedent images, we heard feedback from stakeholders that really piqued our interest, as you can see here. And it really sort of made us have a pause, and we wanted to peel back the onion. As Mena has started to unpack, there's a lot of systemic complexity and lack of inclusion in our built environment. And so we started to identify these masculine and feminine qualities of the space. And it's not lost on us that there is a lot to unpack based on culture and history and context, to name a few. There's also a significantly substantial gender data gap. And so we're not trying to say we've got this figured out, but we're trying to start to unpack it and sort of based on the application of QuantCrit centered in sexism. Numbers are not neutral, categories are not natural, and data does not speak for itself. And so there's the value of statistics is derived from their use. So all that being said, it led us to ask, how can we apply a critical lens to study design as we engage the issue of gender in design? And so to frame our research, it is important to be clear this is not about men versus women. It's about inclusion and getting a better understanding of femininity, masculinity, and sort of the whole in between and outside of that. So there are perceived conceptions of masculine or feminine patterns within the built environment. And as you can see here, this is just a quick Google search, boys' room, girls' room. You know, there's already patterns that start to reveal themselves. Dark, striped, more bright within the boy space, and within the girl space, there's sort of bright rooms, white, pinks, light woods, plush fabrics. So what is this suggesting? Where are these patterns coming from? And are they culturally imposed assumptions of what children may like? And is there any data to support that? So that's really something we started to unpack. There's also this piece of language. It's important to include these definitions for our work. In addition, we framed our language with focus groups and evaluated the words that we chose and used tools like Building Without Bias, where it sort of scales words based on he and she. And then we started to try to tap into these ideas of masculinity and femininity. So we created an instrument, and we were able to survey after we did around 6 tests, which included 324 people who identified as she, 173 that identified as he, and 24 that identified as they. And this was over an undergraduate group, and then a professional group, which was released in English and in French, and in the US and in Canada. And also noting that translation from French is not a direct translation either, because there's sort of the complexity of language, the implications of certain words in certain languages as well. And so we were very careful to make sure that there wasn't anything that it was embedded in what we were asking based on the language. And so that sort of set the framework for what we were starting to try to unpack. And so within our instrument, we used masculine language, feminine language, and belonging. So essentially, belonging is proven to have an increase in educational success and impacts cognitive resourcing and emotional wellness for students. And for these reasons, we use belonging scale. It's a robust and established scale to study the sense. And so with masculinity and femininity, we added a 4th theme as a bit of a decoy, as to not make it very obvious what we were trying to target and unpack. And so that's sort of inspiring, motivating, modern, and complicated. And so we were asking these questions for spaces. How do the respondents feel in response to these spaces? And so we were able to run that with the professional group and the undergraduate group, which actually revealed interesting findings based on sort of the group that was being surveyed. And so we started by studying a space that is important, and that is the classroom. And each and every one of us has been in a classroom. And so understanding if these spaces are actually inclusive for the students within them. And this is based on sort of an elementary school classroom as a starting point, based on sort of the school that we started with, but this will continue to unpack as we continue our research. But by creating 4 classroom spaces, we initially used our intuition of what a masculine space would look like, and that's space 1, all the way to what a feminine space would look like, say space 4. And this is just based on, that Google search, how are we defining masculine and feminine? That's really a big part of what this research was about. And so a bit of a chicken and the egg tension. But what we did was validate, that that with our respondents that they were in fact space 1 was felt to be most masculine and space 4 to be most feminine. And so from there we were able to move on and get into unpacking what was happening within these spaces. And so just not to get into the fine minutia, but really what we found that between space 2 and 3, where the asterisks are, that is where there was the most statistically significant trending. And so starting to unpack our 4 spaces, space 1 here perceived as masculine, a lack of color, and it's quite angular and linear. And empirically, it was strong gendered impacts for the they group. So this was quite interesting, suggesting that there was quite a guttural reaction to this space from the they group. And that's a trend we started to notice. So you can see in orange, it's he, and in purple, it's she, and in green, it's they. And so you can see there's a significant reaction from the they group within the belonging space. As we move into space 2, it feels more familiar, more of a status quo. There are strong perceptions of wood as well. And empirically, there wasn't a very high statistical separation between the subgroups. Space 3, there was a shift in gender perception. So color started to play a role. And then there was moves to the curves and furniture. So there's that aspect as well. How can furniture and its movability and the perception of that also play into how a student might feel within the space? And then empirically, there was a strong response from our subgroup FemProg, so feminine progressive as well. Moving on to space 4, very similar findings to space 3. The difference in the far wall, the sort of focus of the wood as well. Empirically, he and they subgroups rose to match FemProg within the space as well. And so speeding through this, I wanted to just say we started to frame it and then unpack it. And so really space 2 and space 3 were the spaces that piqued the most interest. Space 1 and 4 sort of were put to the side, and fairly obvious that they skewed masculine and feminine, and that was validated. And so what we did was we had established certain constants and variables, and so within the space you can start to see, the form factor of the classroom was consistent, but within what was within that, the ceiling height, the finishes, the arrangement of casework within sort of the entryway, change the light fixtures and elements like that. I guess, aspects that you can start to unpeel and refinish so that this research can actually be applied to the classroom space and won't necessarily require a whole overhaul. So understanding space 2 and space 3 had the most interest. What we found, more neutral, bright white wall finishes within the use of color. There's, of course, color theory. It's highly subjective. So, but with the use of turquoise, it tends to promote a sense of serenity and calm. And there's also the use of natural tones, natural materials, light versus dark woods as well. And from a perspective, we took the views from a from a standing height, and there's also the seated height. Without unpacking this with a great deal, there's the average standing height can also of a male is what's sort of set by. So all of this is a lot to unpack, and so we set that at 5'6". We started to unpack more the flooring finish, so the use of wood and carpet and warm tones. From the casework, there was the wood and the color and sort of the zoning of the space. So open spaces, high ceilings. We had 9-foot ceilings in both of these instances, and within the entryways, it was a sort of a compressed zone when you enter the classroom, and then in space 3, it was a higher space within the threshold of the classroom. And so those entryway experiences can have an impact as well. As we move to sort of the ceiling finishes, so drywall versus ACT, the more institutional approach for the ceiling treatment versus sort of the smoother texture might imply certain institutional implications, residential implications as well, and sort of that feeling of comfort. So with space 3 being what the respondents were most interested in, highlighting that perhaps sort of a more neutral lack of institutional qualities could improve sort of the perceptions of sense of belonging within the space. Lighting arrangements, so we have diffuse, linear, and sort of not in your face as well. But finally, this sense of visibility, so perhaps a sense of security, a sense of intimacy in being able to see across the entire classroom, seeing and being seen, the opportunities to view nature as well. And then finally, looking at the desking approach, so collaborative desking, low flexible seating, warm and colorful, and then open cubbies versus the closed cubbies. So that's where we started to compare and contrast space 2 and space 3 based on the feedback. And we had undergraduate versus professional findings. And so what was consistent between the two was that space 3 was the most piqued the interest of the groups. And so with both of these, we found bright, a sense of security and visibility, a sense of intimacy, views of nature, collaborative desking, low and flexible seating, color and warmth of wood, openness, qualities of the home, natural tones of flooring as well. So these are start to be attributes that we want to continue to unpack and understand why these are feeling much more comfortable to the respondents. So if my colleague was with me, he would unpack this much more. He is sort of the research guru. But really what we're seeing here is that as designers, this is very relevant to us. The undergraduate findings show that there's a negative correlation towards belonging and feminine perceived spaces, whereas this was not the same with the designers. So suggesting that there is something embedded in our training that may override our instincts of the non-designers. So in other words, there's designer expectation versus user experience, which are at odds. There's a preference for certain aesthetic in response to context, clean lines, a partie, all ingrained within our education, which are reinforced and sort of encouraged by acclaim. And so this was at times in contradiction to the type of spaces that are best for learners. As designers, we're taught a certain way, and that may not necessarily jive with what is best for a student. And so we just need to be aware that there are different needs. And so space needs to be more flexible and respond. And there's an opportunity to really question some of our training and to acknowledge that user experience and user input is in fact the priority. And so a high level overview of sort of what we learned. There's number one, a bit of a caveat here. There's the pedagogical approach. There's many ways to unpack a learning space, from sort of an incubator to a hybrid model. Classrooms are really starting to evolve and become a lot more flexible, a lot more collaborative. And so you need not only the institution to be on board, the teachers to be on board to teach in this way that not only responds to the students, but responds to sort of is supported by the learning environment. And so it could be direct instruction versus collaborative, so on and so forth. Considering the other senses. So this is, of course, a rendering. It's visual. It would be nice to move our research into all of the senses, be that, goggles or doing a mock-up, I think by moving people into the space, it can really start to reveal more. There are cost implications as to our choices. So, using certain materials within the space, there are implications that as designers, we are more aware of how much that will cost, and perhaps choices will be made to limit the expense. And there's also alternate design approaches. So, there are many ways to build out a classroom, but this is sort of framing where we're starting with our research. And there's opportunities, of course, as well to input some more biophilic design as well. So high level, start from the position of not being antagonistic, include more perceived masculine or feminine qualities of the space rather than removing. So it's about richness of representation rather than taking away representation. And applications to practice, I think this is linking back to what we've been hearing today. It's really about questioning sort of the framework of where our education is right now, looking at opportunities to understand what role does our profession play. There's male-dominated teaching. The profession is quite male-dominated as well, and white as well. So how is that informing the design decisions that we are making? Understanding, the iconic design influencers that we look to, and perhaps there's opportunities to challenge how we design based on that. And then there's perception of sort of the acoustic qualities of the space. Who speaks and who is heard. So if you're within an environment that is loud, much like that first space one, where it's highly reflective, voices may be drowned out. And so sort of understanding not only the aesthetic qualities of the spaces, perhaps the arrangement, but the materials and how they absorb and who can be heard and who feels welcome to be heard within those spaces. Construct clarity. So you need to know why it matters and understand the language that shapes the thought. So you've really got to understand this is very important and it needs to be a part of our day-to-day with engagement. So understand who is at the table and who is contributing. Often it's sort of the CEOs or the high level, but are they using the space, and who doesn't have a voice, who is actually using the place that you were designing for? So asking the right questions and making sure that the right people are being engaged. Again, it's about richness of representation, not removal. So include attributes that are reflective of more users rather than removing masculine perceived attributes of the space. And then finally, make sure you get feedback and acknowledge that feedback and adapt your design to make sure that it's responding to the voices that are going to be using these spaces. Thank you. That is my quick overview of our gender inclusive design study.
Thank you very much, Julia, for this presentation and addressing gender in design and for unpacking for us such a comprehensive method to understand how these biases play a role in every dimension of architecture. So thank you very much. These are all very important propositions, and now attendees will have the opportunity to have a discussion with our guest speakers in 3 breakout rooms. And well, welcome back, everyone. We are now going to hear first from the moderators of each room, a summary of some of the ideas and questions that were raised in the discussion. And then we are going to open the conversation to everyone, and that part will be moderated by Tammy Gaver. So maybe we can start with room 1. Andrew?
We have to create as many openings as possible and allow those things to make mistakes, allow a kind of improvisational quality, at least to some degree. And we have to allow the assessment of those research streams, I think, I'm maybe paraphrasing, to be less risk averse, to actually say that we can actually fail, we can actually fail a few times, and then allow the thing to either succeed either in a measurable way or in a way that tells a story. But it was really about values and how we define these values and how do we recalibrate our partners around that. So if we do have private partners, how do we continue to educate them? How do we use the mechanisms of the academic environment and the mechanisms of of more in-depth design research. But we talked about activism and the activist scholar and how EDI demands more from the activist scholar. Research projects with social impact have better value with projects that have an implicit or explicit voice. It's about pushing the work out and actually talking about these things almost.
Our conversation was focused on time and methods in research. Something that it was mentioned, it was that time is different in communities. And it was mentioned the idea of indigenous communities, but also rural life in general. So time is cyclical and not linear. And that is something that we need to internalize if we want to really engage into any type of EDI policies with communities and work with this community.
The question framing our discussion group was, how is EDI impacting practice? Well, I mean, it became apparent quite quickly in the conversation that the question itself needed to be questioned, right? So there's a real othering to EDI when you're asking how it can impact practice. And rather, let's look at it in a slightly different way. How is practice responding to the realities of EDI in method, inclusion, and content? Put the onus on practice, right? And so we started having a number of conversations about, who are asking the questions, who's leading the inquiry, whether it's this one or beyond, or in the classroom, like what Minna was talking about, who asks the question, and giving agency to students to really feel able to ask these questions, why and how. And then we ended off the conversation really interesting points about the importance of sharing, right, in studio and studio culture, and a really insightful comment that we can't be a society of inclusion on screens, right? And so it begins with sharing space. And so I thought with that was a really poignant note to end on.
Quickly, just to thank everyone for participating. I mean, this whole cafe initiative was in some ways sort of addressing this crisis of imagination to create ways for people to actually come together across disparate geographic situations to talk about common concerns and to share thoughts and concerns with one another to help us all address it, acknowledging that we're all in that shared situation. So just thank you everyone for the presentations.
Wonderful. So thanks everyone for all of your contributions and coming out today to participate. I think it's been pretty incredible. We have a comment here from Charles, thanking everyone for presentations and discussions and sharing your knowledge. And lots of thank yous on the side. I can't even read them. They're moving too fast. And I think, Lisa, the next event is on service and engagement is on May 27 at 1 p.m. I'll hand it back to you, Natalia. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Okay, I'll hand it back to you because I think our 5 minutes for conversation is up. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I was just going to remind everyone what Lisa wrote in the chat that we'll have on May 27th, the next workshop. And then I just want to thank all our participants and guests, Mena, Honoré, Lancelot, Shaun, and Julia for joining us today. And thank you for sharing your ideas. And I hope that you walk away with new ideas, new strategies, new methods for EDI, but also with a network of people in this idea of the ecosystem and how everything's connected, a network of people trying to work on the same project. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.